it's too late. It's already after 8. Let's get started. So welcome to the 6th event this spring for Taipei Discussion and Learning, or Take Action, Love, Knowledge. Angel is going to be giving a speech about altered states of consciousness, and I kind of titled it, Where Are We and Where Are We Going? Angel, please.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep this shorter so we can have more questions and answers, because I think that's going to be an easier way to talk about this. So let me just first quickly, I'm going to use this as a basic, as a help. So Ethan said altered states of consciousness, but a name that I found better when I was writing my master's thesis was a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So non-ordinary states would be, if you say altered states, it's like something that is altered, something that alternates between normal and not normal. It's like something that is twisted from the normal. So it does have a little bit of negative connotation to it. And instead, we just want to say that there are states which are different from the ordinary waking state that we use in everyday life. And that's why they're just called non-ordinary. In fact, they're not so non-ordinary. If you start studying them, you will see that in many cultures they're very ordinary. They're not so non-ordinary. But for our context, for our culture, then this term might be actually useful. So, besides this state, non-ordinary, I'm going to use another term. It's called holotropic states of consciousness. This is also a very good word. The word holotropic comes from the work of Stanislav Grof. He's a psychiatrist who has more than 30 years of experience with researching into these states in his clinical work. And he came with this term holotropic, which comes from two Greek words, holos, which means wholeness, and tropos, trepein, which means movement. So holotropic means moving towards wholeness. Holotropic states are states where our mind goes into to move towards wholeness. So he said this is even better term because sometimes non-ordinary states of consciousness, they can be caused by some kind of pathological changes in the brain. You know, like some kind of organic change in the brain that can cause people to have non-ordinary states of consciousness. Like people can experience all kinds of weird states if they have some kind of brain problems. Like they can experience inability to perceive movement. They can experience inability to recognize spaces. They can experience inability to understand their language, all kinds of strange, non-ordinary states. So we want to talk about states that have clinical value, like healing value. Those are the most interesting states. And this is actually the best term to use, holotropic states, states that our mind gets into to move towards wholeness. And just going through his work is very interesting because, in fact, you will suddenly realize that there are so many ways that these states can be triggered, like that the holotropic nature of our mind can be triggered. It's interesting because in the mainstream psychiatry, in the mainstream psychology, or even the mainstream study of the mind, philosophy of mind that I study, there is very little talk on the holotropic nature of the mind. Holotropic nature of the mind, that the mind, when put in a certain condition, will actually start moving towards a certain state of wholeness within itself. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about it later, but let's see, non-ordinary states of consciousness in history. So, their history is clouded in the past of humanity. If people have done any research in shamanism, we know that it's at least 30 to 40,000 years old. So it's a very old thing. But why was there a need to induce these states? Like we can see in almost every culture that people have developed very sophisticated means to induce such states. Why? And then you will have this classical Marxist materialist approach to say, oh, people were very afraid to face their death and their reality. That's why they were escaping from the difficult reality, which is so not true. Like, if anybody who has research in these states will know that these states don't facilitate escape. They're not escapist states. Like for example, heroin. Like a drug like heroin can induce, like, you go away from it. Or alcohol. It induces escape from reality. These states can actually induce facing the reality, right? And there are two types that in anthropology, very famous, two very famous rituals that exist in almost every culture that deal with inducement of non-ordinary states. The first one is rite of passage. It's a general name. It's made by a Dutch anthropologist, and basically describes a set of practices or ceremonies that people, usually young people, go through in almost every culture in order to become considered as adults. And there are different kinds of ceremonies. Sometimes, like for example, the Aboriginals in Australia, they would have these walkabouts. That maybe they would have to stay in the desert for a longer period of time and be able to survive there and have visions and vision quests. Spending long periods of time without food or without water, and or actually having your different parts of your body chopped off, and basically going through some kind of, a lot of these states were supposed to induce like dissolution of the old personality. And by going through this, like, somebody would say, oh, that's a terrible child abuse. But actually, when young people would go through that, they would go on the other side as stronger, as more able to deal with life challenges. So they come in many forms and many shapes. There is a lot of anthropological literature on this. The next one, also very interesting, is shamanic crisis. Shamanic crisis is another socially sanctioned way that anthropology has researched to induce this kind of identity crisis. And sometimes it would be induced by outside means, but very often certain individuals would actually enter into such kind of state. And when they would enter into such kind of state, the society would actually help them deal with it in a certain way. And shamans would usually go through a set of events, like the future shamans, like people who would enter into this kind of shamanic crisis would go through a set of events that would usually go through a few stages, like descent in the underworld, some kind of death, and spiritual rebirth. And then they would come out on the other side as changed, sometimes even as androgynous, even as having two sexes at the same time. It's very interesting that, like in Siberia, in some of the Siberian tribes, like that has been also the case. So there are many ways that traditional societies were accommodating these states or inducing them for what they would experience as mutual benefit of the society. Now, let's see. For example, there's an interesting event, like in ancient Greece. There was, every year, there was a huge ceremony in a place called Eleusis. I think it's near Athens. And people would prepare for that during a number of days by fasting and by prayers and ceremonies. And then they would go into a big hall that was called Telestrion. And then they would take a substance called kykeon. And now we don't know exactly, was it mind altering, but from the writings, what we know is that only a cup of 2 of that potion would bring some of the initiates to the brink of madness. So that's how powerful it was. And the mystery of the Eleusis are very interesting because we know a lot of ancient philosophers who participated in them, including Plato. We know Sophocles was also participated. I think some Roman figures who also, when they conquered Athens, they have said that from all the sublime teachings that Greece has given to the Roman world, nothing is so sublime as the teachings of Eleusis. So this was going on for thousands of years. For every year in Eleusis, there was this tradition until it was banned by one of the Christian emperors afterwards. So then we have the spreading of Christianity and slow decline of these kind of practices. But then we know that in Christianity there are also a lot of practices that deal with these states. Like we know Byzantium, the East Roman Empire had lots of long tradition of inducing the states. Like we know the hesychastic tradition of monasticism, about retreating yourself in the desert, in a cave, and repeating a prayer, observing your navel, and then there are a lot of levels that one goes through. It's also a sublime, very sublime science that a lot of people in the West don't even know that it's a Christian practice. It's a very detailed Christian mystical practice that goes from the earliest days of Christianity. It includes fastings, it includes retreat to the desert, it includes long hours of prayer, etc. Let's see what else. Now, so there are 2 general ways. There are many ways how to induce the states, these altered states or non-ordinary states of consciousness. There are many ways how to induce them, by retreat to the desert, by rapid breathing, by using music, drumming, fasting, bloodletting, ingesting different mind-altering substances. So we can generally, in my paper, I'm just separating them in 2 groups. Pharmacological induced and non-pharmacological induced, non-ordinary states of consciousness. So non-pharmacological induced means basically precisely what I said is in the hesychastic Byzantine tradition, like through prayer, through fasting, through isolation, sensory isolation, when people would go to caves, they would retreat, meditation. We have dancing, breathing practices. So all of this is non-pharmacological induced, non-ordinary states. And then we have the pharmacological induced, non-ordinary states that also we have had in ancient Greece, that we have had, we still have in South America. So these are the 2 basic groups of states that I analyze. So I start here with Buddhism. And I talk a little bit more about Zen meditation. So I'm going to use Zen meditation and the states, the non-ordinary states of consciousness which are induced through Zen meditation, because it's a more familiar, this is what I chose to write about, because it's more familiar and it's well written and researched spiritual practice. So I think we all know more or less about Zen practice, right? Okay, so I'm just gonna say briefly. We all know how Buddhism developed, probably. Like it was 2,500 years ago in a little kingdom in today's Nepal. There was this prince called Siddhartha, and then he saw the suffering of the world. He decided to leave his worldly life and engage in those days classical, traditional yogic practices that were widely spread in that part of the world, and he joined several different groups and studied with several different teachers meditation. And at some point he found that there are some, not flaws, but he found out that the practice that he has learned from his teachers brought him to a certain dead end. And that by keeping fostering this kind of practice, he's not leaving the world of suffering because his goal was to find the way out of suffering. But by keep doing this very austere ascetic practices, very strict yogic practices, he is actually, at some point, like he is there, inducing very deep levels of samadhi, of meditative absorption, but actually he's hitting some kind of dead end. So at some point he realized that where the problem is, and apparently he found a way out of suffering, right? And he was the founder of this new religion called Buddhism. So Buddhism spread from India to China in many different directions, and different Buddhist schools spread to China. And for some reason, it found very fertile ground in China, and it left India. Very strange. Like Buddhism basically left India after several hundred years, but it continued to flourish in China. And China became the new, China and Sri Lanka became the new centers of Buddhism. Now, the history of Zen practice is that we have this monk from India, Bodhidharma, who moved from India to China, and he saw how people practiced Buddhism in China, and he was not very happy with the practice. There were a lot of esoteric practices. There was a lot of theory. There was a lot of there were a lot of things he was not very satisfied with, and then he started teaching today's Shaolin Temple, and he started teaching. Basically, he started teaching again yogic practices, but in some way these yogic practices revived and gave new spark to Buddhism. So the name Zen comes from the Hinduist word jhana. Jhana means basically that's one of the states of meditation absorption, and it's a yogic practice of strict meditation. And from jhana it became chana. From chana became chan, which is the Chinese name for Zen, and from chan became Zen in Japan. That the Zen is basically the Japanese pronunciation. So jhana, chana, and then it became Zen, and this is how we know it. Now, for my personal information, basically, I used the writings of a very famous Taiwanese Zen master, Sheng Yin. Sheng Yin was a founder of one of the biggest Zen centers and schools in Taiwan. He is one of the people who revived the Zen Buddhism in Taiwan. In fact, he was the founder of Dharma Drum Mountain, and he wrote a lot of things on Buddhism. So basically, he said that the Zen practice is basically very simple. Like unlike the Tibetan Buddhist practice, which is esoteric, it's very much related to the guru-disciple relationship. It's this personal relationship it's very important. It has a lot of practices which are hidden, which are not open to talk. Zen Buddhism, in a way, after it moved to China, it started merging with the Chinese Taoist practices. And it's being said that Zen Buddhism, after it moved to China, now it became Chan. Like it resembled on a Taoist dragon with Buddhist eyes for enlightenment. So after Zen established itself in China, the Zen masters start engaging in a lot of different modifications in order to help students achieve what Zen was after. basically to have you experience enlightenment in this life. So this is what Zen Master Shengyan says about the Zen practice. It goes to 3 stages. The first stage is when you start, the novice, like the scattered mind. Like our minds are very scattered. We think, we have a lot of thoughts, we have a lot of different ideas. And then from scattered mind, we move to one mind, to practice. How do you do that? Basically through observing the breath, through observing the body sensations. There are several different ways, through chanting different mantras. You can recite the name of Buddha or just say kind of different mantras that are there in Buddhism. This is how you move from scattered mind to one mind. But this is a very important step. And now there are many levels of this one mind. Basically, this is the state of samadhi. There are many levels. And according to Shengyan, most of the Hinduist practice deals with the samadhi states. So Hinduism apparently, during the times of Buddha, but there, you see, now it's very difficult when you talk about Hinduism because Hinduism is also such an amazingly broad conglomeration of teachings. But in the case of Buddha and in a lot of yogic practice, it is true that Hinduism deals with levels of samadhi, levels of meditation absorption that basically you achieve through chanting, through yogic practices, through observing the breath, calming the mind, and apparently at some point, like one of the deepest states of samadhi can be even when your breathing becomes internalized. Like even when you stop breathing, when a person stops breathing on the outside and everything just starts circling from within. These are very deep meditation states. I don't know if they're real or not, but they exist in the yogic tradition as one of the deepest states of samadhi. So Buddhism in general, especially Zen Buddhism, doesn't usually, it still depends on the school. Like in some Buddhist schools, they would go for very deep levels of samadhi. But usually, what Shengyan says is that, yes, there are these levels of samadhi that when the practitioners start going into, through observing the breath, through many days will pass, and then you do the breathing. What happens is that, of course, you will start entering this state, this non-ordinary state of consciousness, just through sitting there, not moving, and observing your breathing. And this is very interesting what happens. You enter a state that he says you enter a state of one mind. From scattered mind, you enter a state of one mind. State of one mind basically means that you start experiencing oneness. With everything you hear, you become one with it. With everything you think, you become one with it. So all the suppressed experiences that sort of we have in a way disowned, forgot about, like they emerge, but just by keeping the breathing, we become one with it. And we slowly enter, he says, like everything fuses in deeper states with one thought. When you start feeling dissolution between the body and the surrounding, between the inner and the outer, and everything becomes this fused one thought. And this is a state of meditation absorption. And now there are many deep levels, but usually this is not the final goal of Zen practice. Like people can go into very deep level, but this is not the final goal. Basically, this is what Buddha also realized, that at some point you have to leave this state. So the point of the Zen practice is to move from one mind to no mind. So no mind would be when basically realizing that whatever comes into your mind is empty of self. There is no self. Even that one mind, like there is still some kind of feeling of self. Like I am one with the universe. But there is still this I. There's still this cosmic feeling of I. And at some point, even that cosmic feeling of I is just a mind representation. It's just some kind of representation. It's just a phenomenon. And then from that state, even that can break. And the practitioner would go into a state of no mind. Now this is very abstract. What kind of state would that be? In the scriptures called this state a consciousness without surface. So it's very interesting that even those deeper states, like during the time of Buddha, like basically he realized that it's very taxing to maintain these deep levels of samadhi, because you have to live in an extreme ascetic way to maintain that meditative absorption, which can be very powerful. So he basically left that path, and so this is also the goal of Zen practice, like the state of no self. So this is my choice to basically that I talk about mostly in my thesis. And then the next one, so basically about breaking the one's mind state and going to no mind and realizing that all phenomena are empty of inherent self. There is no self, even in what you think there is self to. It's empty. So the way in Zen, one's person is very grounded in that samadhi state. Then the master can use these very strange paradoxical questions, like what is the sound of one hand clapping? What was the face of your mother before? What was the face, or your face before your mother was born? Right? And these or maybe some kind of strange stories. These kind of questions are usually, not always, because there's so many different schools and every master has their own preference, the way he goes to teach his disciples. But usually Shenyan says that like he would use these kind of stories after a person is very grounded into the one mind state. And this is where a lot of foreigners who heard a lot of Zen stories get confused. Like in the 60s, we know the Beat era, Jack Kerouac stories. When Buddhism became very famous, like Jack Kerouac wrote this Dharma Bumps, right? And Buddhism was very famous. And precisely because, I realized my inner nature and I'm free, I don't have to be tied up to this idea of morality that Christianity was pushing on the West. But actually, the Zen practice is very, when it comes to these paradoxical stories that were supposed to make one break to the no mind and reveal the inherent nature of the mind, usually this is used to people who are very versed into who are already very deep into the state of one mind. They are already into some kind of absorption, very deep absorption. Even now, masters are, like Shenyan has talked about his first enlightenment experience. Duan-u, like in Japanese they call it Kensho, right? In Zen they call it, in Chinese they call it Duan-u, flash of enlightenment. And when he had it, basically, he had a very long period of enormous internal doubt about his life, about his path. Should he get married or not? Or what should he do? Like, he was in an enormous state of turmoil that was going for a long time.